Good morning and welcome at the webinar of the Cost Action Distant Reading for European Literary History. As you probably know, today we are celebrating the Day of Digital Humanities, and as this year's focus is on multilingual digital humanities, we decided to present our study about the titles in 11 LTEC collections. But let me first welcome the Action Chair, Professor Dr. Christoph Schöch, and ask him to present the Action and the LTEC collection.
Here, yeah, I think this is a perfect match. The title study and LTEC more generally, with their multilingual focus, are really a perfect match for a Day of the Age on multilingualism. And I think it's a wonderful choice of topic because that's really what one of the strengths of digital humanities is, to look beyond language borders. Now, I'd like to just provide some context to those who don't know the Cost Action from the inside or so well, and we'll just briefly give you a little bit of context so that you see in what context this title study has been developed. And for that, I will just share my screen. I hope this works. If somebody cannot briefly, that would be great. Can you see my slides? Yes, excellent. Thanks, Katja. Yeah, this is a brief presentation about the Cost Action Distant Reading for European Literary History. I will very briefly talk about what cost actions really are, and we'll then focus a little bit on what our Cost Action Distant Reading is really about. And I will skip the other points here on the agenda and just focus on that. So what are cost actions? They are basically networking grants. They support networking and capacity building around specific research topics. They usually build or create and stabilize or further develop networks of European countries, but usually with some international partners. Very surprising little fact is that there are 300 actions running in parallel at any given time, which is really a lot, I think, and not really proportionate to the visibility, or the visibility of cost actions. I think is not really proportionate to the fact that there are 300 of them running at any time, but very few of them actually in the humanities. But there are some relevant actions in the humanities that are also relevant to digital humanities that have inspired us also, like Inter-Edition on digital editions, the European Network of E-Lexicography that is now running in a follow-up project, Elexis, Reassembling the Republic of Letters, an interesting one. NEP for Dissent is one that is running in parallel with us. And we are in exchange with this action. And Nexus Linguarum is a linguistic data science one that started more recently and that still runs for quite a while. And that is also connected to, that has some overlap in interests with our action. Some key features of cost actions are that they usually take 4 years. They're structured into working groups, as usual for European projects. But a particularity is that there's no funding for staff, only for networking activities. So travel money for meetings, for training schools, for short-term scientific missions, all these various forms of networking activities, as they are called. They are listed here, but we can skip this and go right into the question of what is distant reading for European literary history really about. So the cost action we're talking about today. Distant reading is an interesting term. It has been first introduced by Franco Moretti in the sense of second-hand reading in a way. So not reading the texts themselves, but reading secondary literature, research literature about the texts, and I think this is where we already connect to today's topic, by reading the titles instead of the full texts. And so this has developed in meaning, this term, to mean any computational analysis of literary text. This is how the term is basically used today. There are also narrower terms like stylometry that basically from the face of it could mean the same thing, but it is narrow. It really focuses a lot on quantitative methods for authorship attribution. So it's in a way included in distant reading, but it's had a much more specific focus. And there's a new term, computational literary studies, that is in the process maybe of joining distant reading in a way as a term, as a cover term for computational analysis of literary texts. In any case, so our distant reading cost action has a couple of objectives. One of them, and I think that's really has become the key and the fundamental, well, the basis for everything else, is this multilingual reference collection of European novels that we call ELTEC, European Literary Text Collection. Using these collections, we want to explore, evaluate, adapt, and share computational methods of text analysis. And the title studies is obviously an example of this, one particular distant reading method applied to ELTEC. We also want to think about the theoretical aspects of this. So what are the consequences of digital data and methods for literary history and theory? In terms of networking objectives, the project wants to bring together corpus linguists, computational linguists, digital literary scholars, literary historians, and literary theorists, and work together and share our expectations, our experiences with building ELTEC and using ELTEC for research. We want to spread and share competencies in the three areas that were mentioned above among these groups across Europe. And I think we can already see that several centers in a way of distant reading research have emerged and further developed in the last few years. That's very nice to see. And we want to support some relevant grant proposals on national and European levels. In a way, this is also a way of capacity building for distant reading research. At the moment, there are 32 countries involved. More than 200 scholars have been participating in one or the other shape by taking part in a training school, by doing a short-term scientific mission, or by working in the working groups. There are several spin-off projects and also a follow-up project called CLS Infra that has just been launched. The key output is ELTEC, the European Literary Text Collection. It consists of sets of novels of at least 10 European languages, and each set is supposed to comprise 100 novels published between 1840 and 1920. We are working on much more than 10 collections. This is a quick overview, or actually a pretty confusing overview maybe, but let's just focus on this left column here with the languages. So you see there are 18 different collections actually being elaborated, and 8 of them have already reached those 100 novels. Some are very close, some are still in progress. But so this, under this link here, you can find this, but more than 1,300 novels have already been published, encoded in XML-TEI, valid against the schema. And so this is the key output of the action, and also the basis for the work in other working groups, and also the basis for the work on the titles that we're going to hear more about now. That's all from me. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for this concise but also very rich presentation of our action and ELTEC. And let me now start with the presentation, sharing the presentation. Okay. So let me first announce that the article will be published soon in the journal Interférence Littéraire, and you can find a link to the article in the chat box. Unfortunately, Dr. Roxana Patras, the first author of the article, who also initiated our collaboration, could not attend the webinar. Regrettably, we are also missing Dr. Joanna Galleron, who importantly contributed to the article as well. But I'm very pleased that I can now introduce Dr. Caroline Odebrecht, who will tell us more about the methodological part of the study. So, Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks for everybody attending this webinar. I will just briefly introduce some initial thoughts about what we are going to do. Maybe Katja, could you go on the next slide? Thanks. This study started as, well, a kind of idea between me and Roxana. It was designed as a use case for LTEC. It has an exploratory character, and we thought it would be nice to start with something which might be important, but is not always in the focus of research, the titles. We have a relatively small amount of data. We used a subset, currently subset of LTEC last year. LTEC is growing, as Christoph already showed. And it's a relatively small amount that we can analyze deeply, meaning manually. So everybody of us took some language collections and annotated manually. So it's a mixture between close reading and distant reading, when close reading means annotation manually, and distant reading then analyzing our titles in a quantitative and more abstract way. We would like to contrast our little exploratory study with common data-driven approaches. And the challenge is that we need uniform categories, meaning annotations, for a multilingual diachronic dataset. And we would like to combine our analysis base, the annotations, with different metadata that are already available in LTEC. And one of the strengths for LTEC is that we got many metadata next to title, author, and stuff like this, which we can also include in our analysis. As this is an exploratory study, we didn't have a clear, focused research question. We would like to just start with an exploratory view on the titles and what we can get on this with the help of annotations. The goal is, for this study and for future studies, as this study might be just one step, try to answer questions that go deeper than counting words alone. And that's one of the focus in this study. Katja, could you make one? Thanks. So we thought, okay, we don't go, as Christoph say, into the text itself. So we focus on titles and questions that should be answered with the annotations in an exploratory way is what is in the title. And we thought it would be nice to see and interesting to see whether we find differences, common trends on persons, entities, places, genre indicators named within the titles and novels in LTEC. The second question or questions would be, what is the structure of the title? So we are looking at phrase structure and subtitles, if there are subtitles, yes or no. And we would also like to look in when and where do we find which kind of titles. So combining metadata to the titles, like time slots, publication places. And one question which is just also scratched on the surface, who wrote what? So we also are combining our annotation of the titles with the author's gender and language. Not every question placed here in the slide is answered in the title study we published, but these questions are guiding us. And as I said, I think this is one step from a bigger title study, which we can might contribute in the next year. So just to give you a brief overview of what we did, maybe next slide. Here's a short example of what we did. We extracted the titles from this survey from the overview table, which Lou Bonat created, which Christoph already showed us. Also extracted the relevant metadata. And then we got through each title of each language collection we got so far, and annotated separately if a title contains a place, yes or no, or a person, yes or no, 2 elements, yes or no, and locations. For example, I used one French title, and whether you know French or not, the annotation will say if you got a place or a person or two elements. So you don't need to know French for reading the study and following the talk here. That is one advantage of the annotation. The other one is that it's explicit, that we identify, for example, a place, which is in this case Metz, or we identify persons, which in this case is Colette. And Colette, we annotated that she's a female person, which is for the F, female. And we also annotated the status, which is mentioned. And here it's a jeune fille. So this is something which also needs deeper insights of the language and also of the cultural context in the countries or in the publication area where the novel is placed. We also annotated if there are 2 elements. In this case here we have 2 elements. We have the name of the jeune fille and then Histoire d'une jeune fille de Metz. And we also annotated whether there are separated marker like interpunctuation. And we also annotated whether we got genre indicators, yes or no. And in this case, we got histoire, which means history, more or less. That depends on your theoretic background. And we also annotated the structure of the phrases within the title. In this case, for example, we got the location, which is a prepositional modifier, and the person is the head of the entire phrase. And this different informations are all annotated for each title we included in our study, which is only a subset of our text. And what is also important that we also annotated whether there is no person or no place or no to content element. So we just don't annotate whether there is something, but whether there's something missing, which makes an analysis more more useful than only annotated what's there. And this is just for a start what we did, and I think the more interesting parts will follow now with the different analysis of our exploratory data. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And now Dr. Tsvetana Krstov is going to tell us more about the data collection.
Good morning. And the next slide, please. Yes, I will tell you something now about how the data was collected. And first, we used the status of the ELTE corpus as it was on June last year when we started writing this article. And we included the 11 languages: German, English, French, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Slovenian, Spanish, Serbian, and Ukrainian. And that amounted to 798 novels or titles of those novels. For our study, for collecting what we needed, we used the headers. Each of these novels has a header with the metadata, and we were interested in the year of the first publication, the author's gender, the size of novel. There are other metadata, but we were interested mostly in this particular data. As you can see in the diagram here, the size of these collections were not equal at this time. Some were more elaborated, some had more novels than the others. And also here is a diagram showing the distribution over time. So we can see that for German, English, and French, the novels were almost equally distributed over time, and for some other languages it was not so, for various reasons. I will not go into that now. But for many languages, for instance, there were more novels in this last period, that means the beginning of the 20th century. The next slide, please. We also use the other metadata, whether the author was male or female. That's the diagram on the left side. So you see here again that for German, English, and French, there are more or less the same number of novels written by male and female authors, and for Polish also, but for other languages there were much more novels written by male authors, again for various reasons, mostly historical reasons. And then on the diagram on the right side, you see what was the length of the novels. We can again see that for many languages there are more short novels than medium size or long novels, again for various reasons. But we could use all this metadata for our study. The next slide, please. The next slide, please. And then we collected data in a structured way, as Caroline has already pointed, from the titles. So we analyzed each title, and we were looking for specifics that could be found in these titles. First of all, we looked whether there were some references to places. So for if there were references to places, then we were looking what was the entity, whether there was some attribution to it, the terminer, then what was the role of this entity, the syntax of it, and then at the end we also trying to find whether it is the place that can be localized on the map, some place that can be found on the map, or it was an imaginative place or something else. And there were some predefined answers to all these questions, except place entity, which was obviously what was found in the title, and everything else were the predefined values that enabled and facilitated the analysis afterwards. So we see here that one title in French that has two references to places. There can be no reference to places, one, two, in some cases even more references to places, and we see how these values were given to all these features that we were looking for. The next slide, please. Next, we were looking whether there were some references to persons. For persons, we were looking whether there is a reference to person, what was the status of person, which entity was used, whether there was some attribution, determiner, gender of that person, person role, and syntax. Here again, we see one German title that has reference to two person entities, and they were described in a way that uses some predefined values. Here we can see, for instance, that the gender can be masculine, feminine of the reference of the person, or the value D meant that it was diverse, or it cannot be defined which one was, or it was diverse, referring to both men or female persons. The next slide, please. Then we were looking for some other references that were neither persons nor places, with a similar attributes, all also having predefined values except for the entity itself. Here we see an example for the Romanian title that uses these other references, which was in this case mystery and death. The next slide, please. And then we looked whether there were some complex titles that consisted of two or even more separate constructions, and how these two parts of titles were distinguished, and whether they contained some indicator of the genre of this novel. Here we see one example from the Portuguese, which has a complex title separated by punctuation sign, which is in this case full stop. Yes, it has a genre indicator, and here it is some episodes in someone's life. It was used as a genre indicator. So in this way, we collected data in a structured way, which enabled us to further process it in various ways, as you will see in the next slides and in the next presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsvetlana. And now we will discuss several thematic entities, persons, places, other entities, and thematic entities, genre indicators, to ascertain what kind of entity appears with what frequency in the sub-collections under study. From here, we hypothesize about titling patterns of the Great Unread and about particular aspects of titling in the 11 sub-collections of LTEC. In our annotation, the category person entities comprises three types of reference to persons, proper names, statuses, and pronouns. The analysis of the evolution over time reveals that frequency of all entity types decreases in the time slot 3 and time slot 4. In other words, the total amount of entities decreases towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. However, this trend might indeed reflect a sampling imbalance, as several collections, Polish, Romanian, Slovenian, and Serbian, included more novels for time slot 3 and time slot 4. In all the time slots, reference features prominently in titling. This goes along with Moretti's observation that proper nouns appear frequently in 19th century titles. I quote Moretti, "Proper names are even more frequent, especially at the turn of the century," end quote. However, our data show that person entities are not always designated by a proper name, and some interesting differences in title practices appear between the sub-collections. In the English sub-collection, for example, names appear in 63% of all titles, where only 25% point towards status, which is more often than not individual rather than collective, such as The Tutor's Ward rather than A Tale for Mothers and Daughters. This is also the case for the Spanish titles, with 67% out of the 46 titles, including a name, and 45% a status. It is significant that collective person entities are scarce in both the English and the Spanish collections. To the contrary, this proportion is slightly equal or in favor of statuses in the Italian, French, Polish, Portuguese, and Romanian sub-collections. For instance, in the Portuguese collections, 58% of the person entities are designated by status, while only 42% 2% are named by proper names. In the Romanian collection, the predominance of statuses is even clearer, more than 60% of all person entities. While the reasons for these preferences remain to be understood, they appear as a promising opening for further investigations. Frequent status in our collection can be grouped by family, social ranks, and citizenship. The following figure shows the person's statuses as a word cloud. Not very surprisingly, titles referring to women express their family affiliation rather than professional roles or citizenship: mother, daughter, sister, mistress, ward, and so on. For male person entities, we find quite symmetrical family statuses: father and grandfather, great-grandfather, husband, cousin, son, and brother. Nevertheless, the social statuses of women, unlike that of men, are the only ones to explicitly express violation of social norms. She may be a sinner, a captive, a divorcee, or a witch. In this respect, the only notable exception about men are the Romanian outlaws Haiduk and Thief, and the anarchist extremist statuses of the radical, the partisan, the profess, the errants, the usurpateur, and agitador in Portuguese collection. Accordingly, a suggestion about the violation of the moral code can fulfill the seduction function. On the contrary, male person entities are often connected to diverse jobs such as professor, physician, weaver, mayor, lawyer, priest, captain, and so on. These dominations are almost non-existent for female entities, even if one finds mentions of a peasant woman, a watchmaker, or an ironing woman. There is also a noticeable difference concerning first and last name. While female characters dominate by first names, male characters often have a surname. A title from the Polish collection seems particularly illustrative here: Krysia bez imienia, Krysia who has no name. Sometimes one can find last name without the first name, but almost never just the first name for male persons. Sometimes there is a surname next to a woman's personal name too, but in some cases it expresses property, like Radetic Mara and Mikkel Zala. In German, English, French, Portuguese, Polish, and Ukrainian collections, female authors tend to point towards female person and entities in titles. This could be related to the longer tradition of female authorship in these literary traditions, and maybe to the intensity of the female movement in these literary traditions. An exception may be found in the Romanian collection, where female authors favor male and diverse person entities. Overall, in the LTEC, there are almost no titles involving both female and male names, with a few exceptions such as Louise et Barnavaux. Comparing female gender across different time slots did not confirm the hypothesis that with the progressing women's movement and the increasing number of women writers on the literary market, the number of eponymous heroines would increase. This can be also seen, as you see now, in this figure. And with this figure, I am concluding my presentation, and I'm giving a floor to Dr. Rosario Arias.
Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. In the sub-collections under study, place entities can be organized in two main categories. Those that can be put on a map, absolute, for example, A Conquista de Lisboa, the Mysteries of London, and those that cannot be located, relative. As shown in figure 1 on the left, this second category tends to increase over time, while real place names are distributed in a more equal way. In terms of national preferences, it is interesting to note that some collections For example, Portuguese, French, German, Italian contain more absolute references, while Spanish, Polish, Romanian, and Slovenian balance them out. English subcollection contains relative and non-localizable, whereas the Serbian one clearly opts for absolute place entities. I think this premise is, if it's confirmed, we can explore this in the future. Also, more research is needed to analyze why authors seem to prefer to add more or less specific geographical references, and whether or not there is a correlation between the nationality of the authors and the locations mentioned in titles. Next slide, please. As far as genre indicators are concerned, as the 19th century progresses, generally speaking, titles contain more information. However, the French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English subcollections offer very little about genre, whereas the Italian, Polish, Slovenian, and Serbian collections show genre indicators. They can be found in the subtitles or as an apposition, for example, El Testamento de Don Juan I, Novela Histórica Original. We have traced 3 different editions, possibly due to mutual influences. French, Italian, and German collections that choose Roman. The second tradition, second trend, Slavic-speaking country subcollections are preferred Povest. And the English and Spanish subcollections that refer to novels. Next slide, please. Some titling practices include alternative words to indicate novel, depending on the length and depending on other aspects, as they might refer to a different approach to the word novel as a genre indicator. The choice of words such as story, historia, perhaps meant to provide an air of verisimilitude that the word novels did not carry apparently, or perhaps indicated a certain rejection of the genre. More research is needed in this sense. And thank you. I hand it over to Berenike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosario. So Dr. Berenike Herrmann will tell us more about length, double, single titles, and so on. So Berenike, the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk about the composite patterns included in our study. So let's now try and get everything that we heard so far together in a yet another way of distant reading, looking at, as it were, higher order patterns. So what we see here is the first unit of analysis that we can look at, which is words. So just counting the words per title. And you can see here quite clearly in this stacked bar chart that most of the titles of the whole collection, so over the 11 sub-collections, prefer titles with about 3 to 4 words, which is somewhat in line with what Moretti said, what we heard before about a tendency towards a condensation. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Because I just got a message. This tendency towards condensation also within our time period might be cautiously observed from our data. What you can see all the way to the right is a lump, which is a bit misleading. So this 10 to 22 words, it just means that all the rest categories of the long titles are stacked there up to each other. So titles altogether can be between 1 and 22 words, with the majority between 3 and 4 words. Next slide, please. So this is another unit of analysis, and I chose the entity 303 from Minecraft to symbolize it a little bit. So entities, which is not the same, of course, as words. It's the underlying conceptual unit that we identified in the annotation. We saw this diagram before. I'm now looking at it again and matching it to the numbers, which you can see on the left-hand side. Again, we see this cautiously again observe this temporal trend from our first period towards the last period between a mean entity count of 1.75 to in time period number 1 to 1.54, which is a slight decrease. What we can also see is that the bar chart, the arrow charts, the arrow bars decrease too, which again, cautiously observed, might mean kind of a uniformity in terms of the variation, that over the whole collection, titles not only get shorter in terms of the number of entities included, but also very less seen altogether. Next slide, please. Here we can see the distribution across different length classes, again, measured in terms of the entities. Again, you can see this, how would you, mustard colored type of bar. You can see that the titles with just one entity are by far the largest group, and they actually make up more than 50%, almost 52% of all the titles. They also increase over time. Again, I repeat that, right, cautiously, because we just have these altogether few data points, but again, we have this varied multilingual corpus, of course, which is kind of it's a very balanced corpus, as you have seen. So as literary scholars, of course, we can, first of all, we say, okay, there seems to be this trend towards condensed titles, short titles, just one entity, and then follow up, you know, the runner-up would be this, the two entity title. But as literary scholars, we're interested in the deviation, of course. And we can see, there is an animation in there. Could you just try and, I hope it's not lost. Click on it, perfect. So interested in the longer titles and deviation. Here you have three examples from 3 different language subcollections, which make up, you know, if you look to the right in each of these bar chart clusters, you can see that the long titles, they are present. They're very small, but they're present, and they seem to increase too. So 5 entity titles, 4 entity titles, and 6 entity titles. Here are a couple of examples, and it of course might be that the authors who chose to have these long titles, or also of course the publishers, the editors, and so on, they chose to do so because of a distinguishing, you know, function of this when the trend is towards a condensation or shorter titling practice. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here you can see the variation, of course, across the subcollections, which is the strength of this study. Could you add the animation there? Yes, perfect. So this is at 50%, and you can see that most of the subcollections actually prefer 1, 2 or 3 word. Again, now the unit of analysis is the words, not the entities, titles. But you can also see that there are a couple of deviations from that. For example, Italian, Serbian, and English already have 4 word titles within these 50%. And then again, if we look at the longer titles up to, you know, the top, the dark blue, we can see that almost all the subcollections have at least 10% very long titles. Italian, Romanian, Serbian, and Spanish really have 30% or more of these. So this is an interesting observation also, that Portuguese really is removed from you know, its sister subcollections in the Latin language group. You know, reason to follow up on this, of course, and further studies and larger collections. Then the next slide, please. So a different way of looking at patterns is looking at compositionality at more or less the syntactic level. So before you heard about, you know, the number of units involved in the titles, and this is to the left, you can see one example from the German subcollection, Der Sonnenwirt, which has a title and then a subtitle, which is not very legible, but you know, you can see how this is actually comes along in the printed collection. So this would be an example of a two entity title. And actually most of the collections prefer this type of titling practice, but there are exceptions. Could you click on the animation I marked exactly? Thank you. The axes mark the collections which actually do not prefer multiple elements in the titles, but just prefer one element titles. One example down below, if you read that, the sign of 4, right? It does have 4 words, but it's just this level of analysis, just one element. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see this beautiful title, Alas, a Novel, which is a 2 element title, of course. So you can see deviation from the trend in these 3 sub-collections which have a very long novelistic history. And this might actually be the beginning of an answer of why they do that, why they seem to be more condensed and maybe also a bit more vague, which brings me to the next slide. Here we heard about the patterns in terms of who actually collocates with whom or with what. And based on scarce but existent prior research, we would assume, if you could animate again, we would assume that persons might, again, this is the level of entities, persons might collocate with entity persons. So, as we saw before, some princess with some king or whatever in historical novels, or with places actually, so named entities. But if you could click on the animation, what we actually see in terms of the frequency in our collection, composed by sub-collections of multiple kinds, we actually see that persons collocate more often with other entities which are not persons and which are not places. And very cautiously, again, we interpreted that as the early uneasiness with the characters, tending towards, as you can see to the left-hand side, a couple of examples to inanimate objects collocating with persons. Again, interesting food for thought. And the next slide now is our most speculative one, I would say, in terms of what's going on with charades. You can see on the left-hand side somebody playing charade and kind of showing, engaging in some kind of play, right? And showing something, so one has to guess, engage in a riddle. And this is what titles often do, and some do that more than others. And we found basically 2 types of titling in terms of playing charade or not, in terms of ambiguity and specificity. One type is quite vague and seems to lure people into this guessing game. Could you animate again? One example for that would be faith and beauty, very general terms. What is faith and beauty? People, wow, interesting abstract concepts. On the other hand, this other type of titling practice is more precise, is a type of subordination construction, memories of Judas. So it's a specific name. We can link that to our historical knowledge, world knowledge, or we could map it on a symbolic level, but it's more specific than the first one. And what we see here is that French, Serbian, Ukrainian, Slovenian, and Italian seem to favor the blue one, so the just existent denomination, something exists and we have to guess what's really going on, right? Whereas German, Polish, and Spanish seem to favor the more specific reference in the title, and English, Romanian, Portuguese seem to be half-half, more or less. So this is the type, our finding about the charades, which we will hopefully find out more about, and on bigger collections, maybe with you together. And this is the end of my part, and now Dimitrov is hopefully, Dimitrov is joining. Thank you.
Thank you. So please, the next slide. So transparency, we share our data set collected in the framework of this research with anyone, so anyone can check the relevance of all calculations, of our conclusions, of our visualizations. All of them are available, freely available on the Zenodo platform. You can see the link in the bottom. About visualization, you have seen quite a number of them, and we used different tools in order to make these calculations and to create these pictures, these plots. To name some of the tools, it's RStudio, Voyant tools, Inkscape, but also such usual and simple like Microsoft Excel. We also used other sources from the internet, freely available, of course, like this picture made by NASA. We put our genre indicators in order to make it more visible, more obvious for readers, for the audience. Next slide, please. So what we can say something about the average image of novel title in this 11 LTEX sub-collections. It's 2 to 4 word title, which involves 1 or 2 entities. One of these entities is a person, as a rule. We have noticed that over time, titles tend to become more and more about places and about other entities. What is interesting, and Katya already pointed this moment, that only in rare cases we see both men and women mentioned in the same title. We provided some explanations, some possible explanations, some thoughts on this matter. For instance, that might be the author's intention to avoid the immediate association with kind of erotic plot for the novel, for the title of the novel. And probably the main finding is that our research shows this diversity of title practices in different national literatures, European literatures. It's not easy. It's actually very difficult to find these patterns, these trends in changes of practices over time, to trace influences between different, including neighboring, even neighboring traditions, neighboring literatures. And we have here an interesting contradiction. We know that, probably we know that the father of the Storm distant reading, Franco Moretti, was blamed for the thesis on the dominance of so-called large literatures. We see the quote on the screen. He said that the modern novel first arises not as autonomous development, but as a compromise between a Western formal influence, usually French, or English, and local materials, end of quote. So we do have this French and English collections, sub-collections in our dataset, but we cannot say that exactly these two literatures or some other literatures are the most prominent influencers on other literatures. And the same is between neighboring literatures. So ironically, our title research in the field theorized by Moretti in the field of distant reading reveals that and questions this thesis because we do not have, again, this obvious influencers among the 11 analyzed literatures. So our hope is that this collected data and our conclusions and our results of our research will trigger new research, maybe more focused, maybe more narrow, research in the field of literary studies, but not only in this field. For instance, research of the role of titles in the popularity of books, in the appearing of this phenomena of bestsellers, or in the changes of readership audience, or in the correlation with particular historical events and phenomena like the mentioned women's movement for the rights. So our research is conceived not only as an answer for important questions, but as the one that poses new thought-provoking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitro, also for sharing some ideas about further research possibilities. And now I think that we are all looking forward to the questions and comments from the audience. So you can write in the chat or raise your hand or simply ask a question, because we are not a very big group. So I think I can manage this in this way.
In case maybe I can start.
Yes.
I have just, hello, I'm Simone. I have just a couple of questions because I was looking at the charts. Probably it was Berenice's part. And at a certain point, I noticed that there were some titles with 0 entities. I was wondering what kind of titles were them. How is it possible? And yeah, specifically what kind of titles can have 0 entities annotated, if I saw it correctly, but I think
perhaps Berenice, could you?
Yes, I saw that too. I didn't look it up again in the data. So this is something that, of course, I was actually intrigued by that too. I just thought there might be, yeah, there might, I don't know, actually. Is somebody else looked at that, or do you know it from the top of your head? We might actually, I could try and open the data right now. While you keep on discussing, and maybe I can deliver some results in the end.
Okay, let's take some time. Because I was wondering about the annotation scheme, if there were some aspects that were not included, and maybe they might be included, or if we had very weird titles and nothing to annotate there.
There's a title that comes to my mind and that probably has a 0 entity. Arebour is one, or similar titles that have some alas, or some exclamation, hooray, or I'm just speculating, but that might be a title that has no persons, no places, perhaps some grammatical word, conjunction, or
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you. I again, from the top of my head, I don't remember how we annotated it, but alas, a novel could be annotated as just as a genre marker and not as an entity here. So there's actually one example. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perhaps any other questions or comments?
I have hello.
Hello.
I have a general question, really. To what extent do you think you're investigating the consequences of different cataloging practices rather than differences in, shall we say, authorship or publication behavior? That is to say, if you're looking at the titles as they're given in TEI headers, you're looking at the way a novel has been catalogued, which is not necessarily the same as what it says if you look on the actual title page, or in the way that, say, a novel might be referred to in a bookseller's list. This seems to me, as from a bibliographic point of view, certainly, this is quite an important distinction. And I wondered if you thought about that.
Caroline, are you still with us? Perhaps this could be the question for you, because you started with this research and idea. I don't see Caroline.
Well, I can answer something, because when I started to work on this project, I went through all the titles of the Serbian novels again. And as the novels in the Serbian collections are mostly first editions, and that were prepared for this particular action from the scratch, I had these first editions. So the titles were actually the titles of the first editions, not from the catalog. But then I've seen that there's really a difference between the catalog, in some cases between the catalog and what is on the title page of the first edition. And it is really true that when cataloging, sometimes librarians omit the whole title for some reason. And especially in the next editions, they completely omit the long titles altogether on the edition and in the catalog. I don't know why, because they think it's old-fashioned or something like that, but I want to make it more popular for the new audience. But that is what I have seen. But for the Serbian collection, the titles are the titles of the first editions. But it is true that the difference exists. That is absolutely the truth. For the Serbian, but I'm sure for the other editions as well.
Yes, Marco.
Yes, I have a question. Have you perhaps noticed or even searched for any kind of intertextuality in the titles? I mean, if they are referring to persons that are already characters in previously written novels or famous novels, or the, you know, in the kind of Serbian Homer or Slovenian Petrarch. So are there any such titles that refer to canonic or popular models in a way? Have you searched for this as well?
I had just Slovenian collection, so I don't remember, but perhaps Berenike, you had German and English.
Yeah, I was
complete.
I was just saying that we didn't systematically include this in our annotation, but it's of course a very interesting possible follow-up study. Also, when we did our theoretical work on titling, reading up on what is out there, titleology. So there are different names in different languages for that type of study. Of course, they point towards the intertextuality as well. So it's a very interesting topic, yes. And eventually, I mean, with a larger collection, we could, of course, also establish a network maybe at some point. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Again, Marco, I hope that I see all the participants.
A question. What about the statistics of place entities or place names? If you composed word cloud only of place names, do you think that some places would be more prominent, more frequently mentioned, regardless of the language or nationality of the subcorpus? So are there any, generally European, so to say, place names that appear in all corpora, subcorpora?
Rosario, perhaps?
This is a very interesting question in terms of cross-cutting or approach to the idea of the places. I think by the end and the conclusion, I think we cautiously say that it seems to be a more interesting non places that are not real, but that is a kind of a cautionary note, as we have to have a more a wider approach to expanded corpora, so to have such a more definite assertion, but it might be a tendency, a trend in having no real places with confidence in the titles. But this, as Veronique was saying, has to be stated cautiously because of the number of titles in Spanish sub-collection. For example, I had at the time when we were exploring, I had 45 texts, 45 novels. So I think now that we have over 80, a more an in-depth study or more profound study could be done now, obviously. So I think it's perhaps a follow-up study in terms of places, but it's absolutely fantastic approach to see whether it's a European kind of a trend in that in as far as places are concerned. Absolutely, I would say, just following the conclusions, that it seems that non-real places seem to be a trend, but cautiously. Again, thank you, Marco.
Maybe I can kind of add a little bit in the vicinity. Well, it's not directly an answer, but I think it's interesting. What we found, for example, for the German and the English sub-collections is that they have a tendency to refer to very exotic spaces and places so far away. And that seems to be like, I mean, talking about the attention aspect, right? And the aspect to make readers grab the book. This might be, yeah, what your audience might like in these two realms. But on the other hand, at the same time in German, if there are German places in the German titles, then these are kind of super local at the same time. But there is, so as far as I know, there's few. There's little Hamburg, Berlin, general things. I think there's one reference to Nuremberg. So now we could discuss whether Nuremberg is a very local one or not. But der Stechlin is a small lake somewhere in Brandenburg. Almost nobody knew it before Fontana's titling. That would be an interesting thing to the extremes for Germany.
Okay, any other comments or questions, or perhaps ideas for further research, what we can do as well with these collections? I cannot see any hands or any comments or questions in the chat box. So I assume that we have answered all your questions. And well, I would then like to thank you for your participation and your attention. And I hope that you will follow our activities also in the next months. And you can, of course, follow us also on social media. We have our Twitter account, Facebook. So please follow our activities and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day too.